Well, welcome back to the live stream. I guess it's once again time for me to talk to you for a few minutes. And this time it's about something fun. I live in San Diego, so that means that I get to go downtown every year and go to Comic-Con. I did that again this year, and in fact I put a video up just a little bit earlier. I sort of did a mashup of all of the video that I took while I was down there. I tried to catch some of the cosplayers. I did notice, though, this year that, oh, wow, my music really just stopped quite suddenly indeed. I'm not entirely sure what happened there. I think my I think my iPod just went Tango Uniform. You know, it's really great doing this stuff live rather than recording it, because it reminds me of all the years that I spent in live radio where, you know, pretty much everything fails constantly. So it looks like something else failed here. So we'll see how that does whenever we try to log out of this thing. Anyway, went down to Comic-Con today. I had a lot of fun. Number one thing that I noticed when I got down there, parking is outrageous. Now, it doesn't affect me because I ride a motorcycle, so I get to park for free anywhere downtown that I want. It's a great little thing to have as an advantage whenever you are living here in San Diego and you have to go downtown, because as soon as you get downtown, you just find a space between two cars and you just back your motorcycle in. I have a BMW K1600 GT, so I just pop it up on the center stand and it's nice and secure. I lock the bags with my little BMW key fob and I walk away from it and I get free parking. But I noticed that some of the garages were offering parking for $100 a day down there. I mean, usually you expect to pay $18 or $20 in downtown San Diego, which is expensive enough. But when Comic-Con is here, it is a madhouse downtown. I uploaded a video earlier today that sort of showed everybody who was down there. It's just a massive amount of people that fill the entire Gaslamp district. So whenever you come here and you get down close to the convention center, it's just jam-packed full of people. In fact, it probably took me almost as long to find a parking place to back my motorcycle into as it took to drive down there from my house, which is in the northern part of San Diego. So a lot of people down there, a lot of traffic, a lot of crowds, and it gets a bit irritating, especially around lunchtime. If you get hungry around lunch, your best bet is to wait until about 1 or 1:30 or 2, and then the restaurants kind of clear out. You can go in and get something to eat. There was something that was announced yesterday at Comic-Con that really did excite me, and it's something that we haven't seen in a movie before. You know, there's been a lot of authors, well, I say a lot, a fairly well-known number of authors like Mercedes Lackey and I think Bob Asprin, who have written novels in the urban fantasy genre. But we've never seen it in a movie before. But Netflix hauled up Will Smith onto the stage to announce that he has done a $90 million blockbuster movie called Bright for Netflix. Not going to be a summer blockbuster. They're releasing it on December 22nd. And here's the story. Will Smith is a patrol cop in South Central LA, an LAPD cop in modern-day 2017 Los Angeles. And he learns one morning that he's going to get a diversity hire, an affirmative action hire, as his brand new partner. That's right, Will Smith is going to have to ride along with an orc as his partner. Anyway, they find this little elf girl who has a magic wand that grants wishes, and a bad elf gang wants to take it and do bad things with it. And so there's a lot of high-powered, modern-day, end-of-watch sort of LAPD police action. It's a police procedural set in a modern-day Los Angeles that happens to be inhabited by humans, elves, and orcs. And I think that this modern urban fantasy might be something that there could be some money in for a studio that knows how to do it right. And maybe Netflix is that studio. Will Smith says they gave him $90 million and told him, make the movie you want to make. And so this is apparently the movie he wanted to make. We're always used to seeing elves and orcs and gnomes and fairies and that kind of things. And yes, there are fairies in Will Smith's movie Bright. They're tiny little fairies like Tinkerbell. They're just pests that you try to kill. But here's the thing. We're used to seeing fairies and elves and orcs in these swords and sorcery things where everybody is riding around in horses and carrying swords. You know, the whole J.R.R. Tolkien thing, as if it all happened sometime in the Dark Ages. And I think urban fantasy is an interesting genre. I've read several of Mercedes Lackey's books, and I'm not a big fantasy guy. One of the things that makes it difficult for me to get through Dragon Age Inquisition is all of this fantasy running around the countryside on foot, hacking things with swords, and I'm playing a mage. I don't even have a sword. I just swing a stick around that catches things on fire. And oh my God, is it unutterably boring. Now granted, it's Dragon Age. Dragon Age is generally agreed to be boring as shit. I get that. The Witcher 3, I didn't have that much of a problem with. I enjoyed The Witcher 3. In fact, I bought all of the expansion packs, all the DLCs. So I got the blood and wine and the whole 9 yards. I enjoyed that, but that's rare for me because I'm not really big on the swords and sorcery stuff. But 9mm and AR-15s in sorcery, okay, you know what? Maybe you got my attention. Maybe I'm willing to suspend disbelief a little bit for this. So I'm thinking this Will Smith thing might be really interesting to watch. The trailer that they had for it looked really interesting, and it looked like it might be a pretty good movie. So I'm going to give that one the benefit of the doubt, and in December, I'm pretty certain that I'm going to watch that. Let's talk about cosplay. Cosplay seems to me to be troubling, or at least has the potential to be troubling. Because here's what I notice about cosplay. Yeah, you have all of the regular Star Wars and Star Trek people walking around. After all, you can't forget the classics. But you've got a lot of girls running around who are, depending on your point of view, I suppose, either showing off their sexy, sexy bodies or inappropriately exposing their bodies to the transgression of the male gaze. Either way, both of those things are happening with a lot of these cosplayers. I wonder about that. Why is it that the girls get in these really sexy costumes? It seems to be the one time a year that you can just see girls outside of the beach just running around downtown San Diego. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't say girls because that obviously shows that I'm a member of the patriarchy. They're women, and I spell that with a Y. And these women walk around very scantily clad, bare midriff. They cover up just the important bits, but sexy cosplay seems to be a big thing. And I wonder how the feminist contingent takes that. Are these women who feel empowered and sexualized in their own bodies, or are these women subordinating themselves to the patriarchal expectations of female sexuality, indeed female hypersexuality, indeed porn-fueled female hypersexuality? Or do they just feel sexy wearing it? I mean, I have a wife, and she doesn't want to have sex if she doesn't feel sexy. Okay, is she wrong about that? Should she feel sexy? Shouldn't she always feel sexy? Shouldn't she always feel empowered? I don't know. What I do know is that a lot of these women are walking around downtown fairly scantily clad. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I guess back in the day, when I was in my 20s, I would have considered it an unalloyed good. Of course, when I was in my 20s, that was a different time. It was the early 80s. Political correctness had barely gotten off of the ground. I mean, in fact, we still called children with Down syndrome mongoloids, and we called the developmentally disabled retards. Not defending it, not saying it was good. That was just the world that we happened to inhabit. And in the fullness of time, we were convinced that the use of those terms was derogatory and probably wasn't the best thing. And in fact, a lot of good has come out of that sort of political correctness. It's kind of hard to believe now, but when I was a kid, we didn't put kids with Down syndrome in school. I mean, they didn't really go to special school. We just kind of assumed they were uneducable. We figured they were all going to die by the time they were 20 or so anyway, so what was the point in giving them much of an education? And we really sort of institutionalized those kids. You know, now you have these TV shows these reality shows, and I forget what it's called, but they have this one reality show that stars these young adults now who have Down syndrome. I mean, crap, they've been to school, they've got jobs. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that political correctness forced us not to dismiss these Down syndrome kids as mongoloids who were uneducable, who basically were considered little better than animals, really, in terms of how we treated them and what we did for them. We basically sort of shunted them aside. And that was true even when I was a kid. You know, it wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that we really started to look into Down syndrome and what the actual mental capabilities of a Down syndrome child was, and how many of them could, in fact, be educated. You probably don't remember this show, for most of you who are young, but there used to be a show that had one of the family members who was an actor with Down syndrome, Corky. And that really, I think, changed a lot of minds about what the possibilities were for children with Down syndrome. So part of that was kicked off, I think, by this move towards political correctness. And I guess the question is, at what point does political correctness stop being an unalloyed good and start becoming a problem? Because I'm fairly sure, well, I'm not fairly sure, I'm absolutely positive, I know for a fact that there are feminists who despise pornography because it sexualizes women. And yet at the same time, they want women to celebrate their sexuality and their sexual freedom. It's difficult to figure out how you can have that both ways. Now, maybe it's because I'm a dummy. Maybe it's because I just don't understand the very, very deep thoughts of someone with a PhD in women's studies. I'm perfectly willing to admit that that's true. But there seems to be, in political correctness, an inability to reconcile some fundamentally opposing thoughts. Because whenever you have that kind of cognitive dissonance, it makes it very difficult to listen to you, because if you can argue both sides of the fence based on whatever is convenient for you at the time, based on whatever subject you're talking about, then it's hard to believe that you're honest and sincere. That, I think, is one of the things about the modern SJW that everybody kind of looks askance at. I'm not going to talk about anybody by name, but there are SJWs now that are well known in the gaming community who appear to be awful human beings. They claim to be victims, they claim this and that, and sometimes you find out that the things that they've said are not exactly true, that they exaggerate. How do you trust people who have such an overt agenda? How do you trust people whose agenda is so overt that it colors everything that they talk about, and it forces them to be less than intellectually honest or less than perfectly honest whenever they discuss these issues? And they talk about, like, the subject of women in video games. Okay, yeah, I can think of a number of video games that sexualize women. I can also think of a number of video games that don't, that treat them as vital characters. I mean, look, go back to 2007 through 2012 and play Mass Effect. Heck, play Mass Effect Andromeda today. The character that you play as Commander Shepard or as Scott or Sarah Ryder in Mass Effect Andromeda, they're the same character. They have the same lines of dialogue. They basically do the same things. There was some little difference in Mass Effect 3 between the female Shepard and the male Shepard's lines whenever they were dealing with the female Krogan, who they had rescued from I guess they hadn't rescued, but they had picked up from Surkesh, the home planet of the Solarians, and the one female, Eve. And of course, we later learned her real name, Urdnot Bekhara. Urdnot Bekhara and Commander Shepard, the female Commander Shepard, had a line about showing the men how to do it, and she said something to Rex about, well, you ought to listen to us sometimes, Rex. Sometimes we women have pretty good ideas. But that was about as far as it went. Otherwise, those two characters are entirely playable and indistinguishable from each other in gameplay. So, yeah, I suppose it's possible to have overly sexualized women in games. It's possible to have overly sexualized men in games too, I suppose. But no one ever really complains about that too much. Why are women sexualized in games? Is it because the game companies are awful, awful misogynists? I would have dismissed that were it not for the fact that looking back over the last couple of months in Silicon Valley, and I can think of Uber as one of the primary examples, but I have a couple of others in mind. We've heard a number of stories from these tech companies about the awful environment that exists for women at those companies. That's kind of an old boys club. I wonder if it's because a lot of these companies are run by nerds, and nerds generally didn't date much in high school and college. They don't know how to deal well with women. And so some things that people might take as offensive are just clumsiness. Maybe. And maybe that's one of the reasons why we see some overly sexualized characters in video games. They're catering to a male fantasy. And look who plays games. Let's face it, your average gamer is a young man. Now, I'm a little older than the regular gamer. I'm 53. I've been playing games for, well, like I say on my Twitch channel, I've been playing video games since there were text on a fucking screen. So I've been around video games for a long time. I'm a little older than usual. Also, I have a little different background. I was active duty military. I've been with the same woman for 26, 27 years now, however long it is. Dear God, I hope she doesn't watch this and realize that I don't have the exact dates memorized. But the point is, I don't really inhabit the world that a lot of gamers do, and a lot of gamers inhabit a world where typically, stereotypically, and maybe the stereotype is wrong, maybe I'm a jerk for even mentioning it, but they're guys who are kind of geeks. They're not really interested in girls. They don't have a lot of access to girls. So they end up on those guys like, what's that comedy, that Chuck Lorre comedy on TV that I've actually never watched, about the physicist nerds. We kind of think of gamers as nerds. Now, that's way less true than it used to be. Gaming, certainly for millennials, has become a much more universal activity. But in general, if you look at the bell curve, the bell curve for gender is kind of way over on the male side, at the thick portion of the bell curve, and females kind of appear at the narrow portion of the bell curve. Women tend not to be as attracted to sort of the action shooting type of games as men are. My wife plays games all the time, but she plays things like Candy Crush. She sees an RPG like The Witcher, and she says, well, I'm glad you're having a good time with it, like I'm the asshole. But women just tend not to play games a lot. The games are marketed to young men. And you know what young men like to see? Tits. Sorry, that's just the way young men are. In fact, older men like to see tits as well. In fact, that's probably true for every man. I was going to say under the age of 80, but I think I'm going to have to push that age up. It's every man. Men are visually stimulated in a way that women are not. And so if you're marketing to young men and you want to visually stimulate them, how do you visually stimulate them? Tits. Because, I mean, take a look at Mass Effect. There's Jack in Mass Effect 2 and 3 as well. If it wasn't for the fact that she was all tattooed up, she would be extremely sexualized. I mean, crap, she only had a little strap that went across her tits. And then, of course, there's the infamous Miranda butt cam shot. Every time there was a scene with Miranda in Mass Effect 2, we had to see her genetically perfect ass and her super large breasts. And even in Mass Effect 3, when Jack and Miranda are having a talk and they decide that they have to say something nice about each other at the party that you throw in the Citadel DLC, Jack's comment to Miranda is, you know, I still hate you, but you've got really great tits. Well, okay. I mean, that's certainly marketing towards men. Is that kind of marketing towards men wrong? I mean, is it a moral wrong in and of itself? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think you market things to people who want to buy them. I think women tend not to be as interested in those types of games as men are, which is not to say that women aren't interested. It is a bell curve. There are people who exist with every possible predilection you can imagine, of every possible sex that you can imagine, who exist somewhere along that bell curve. So I don't say all women or all men, because that's obviously not true. Generalized statements rarely are. But I was just noticing that as I walked down. All these women sort of bearing, in some cases, as much as you can publicly. And I just kind of wondered what that all means in the sci-fi community, and really in the gaming community as well, because the two communities really are very closely interrelated. In any event, that was the thing that I noticed about that. Otherwise, the rest of it was just crowds. It wasn't too hot today, so that was pleasant. The people were really friendly. This is one thing that you do have to say about the cosplayers, men and women. And I imagine it's really irksome for them, and they really handle it with a lot of grace. Yummy iced tea in my huge 64-ounce growler. All of the cosplayers are really friendly. And so the people who go that extra step to do a really good cosplay costume, they really do kind of like to show it off. And so they're generally really happy to allow you to take pictures of them and to pose for you. They're very gracious about it. It must be a little bit of an irritation, because every time you walk outside, you're stopped by basically every parent who has a 5 to 8 year old kid who wants to have their picture taken with you, especially if you're doing any of the relatively well-known superheroes and you've got a cool looking cosplay outfit. You can't walk 5 feet without being stopped and asked to take a picture. And they do bear it up with really good grace and very good humor. So that was really nice to see. The crowd was nice. A fairly large cop presence. You can hear my dogs barking in the other room, even though I have the door closed. There was a huge cop presence there. There was a lot of unarmed security there, I noticed, but San Diego police were out in force. As were Homeland Security. I saw Homeland Security guys walking around the place. So it kind of made you think, yeah, I guess if there was a terrorist attack, this would be a pretty tempting target for it, because there are just thousands upon thousands of people just sort of walking in the open and unprotected on the street. Something horrific could happen, I suppose. And I guess that's just a feature of our modern age, having to deal with that layer of security that's kind of plastered over the top of everything. But Comic-Con certainly has come a long way. I remember the first time I went to Comic-Con was probably back around 1994 or 5. And Comic-Con just wasn't anything back then. It was just this little weekend thing that happened occasionally, and you walked in there, and it actually was a Comic-Con, because there was nothing but comic books in that place. Rare and vintage comic books, new comic books. You know, Marvel and DC would show up with little things. It took up one of the exhibition halls at the Comic-Con, or at the convention center. There weren't any big shows. There weren't any big panels. There were a couple here and there, but for the most part, it was just an exhibition floor where people who did comics, and there were a lot of independent comic book publishers who would show up for Comic-Con and try to hawk their wares. I remember Adam West was there. and was selling his autograph for like $5 or $10 a pop. And so there was a big line of people there to have Adam West's autograph, and that was how he was, I guess, making money back then. And it was just this tiny little thing, and there were no cosplayers there. Nobody was dressed up as anything except for the models that the comic book publishers hired to dress up as comic book characters. Other than that, it was just the regular selection of geeks and nerds like me who wanted to go up there and look at comic books. It was like that for several years. And so when you go down there now and you just see thousands upon thousands of people who are just flooding all of downtown, the entire convention center from one end to the other, and San Diego has a huge convention center. It's just completely stuffed with not just comic book people, but the studios are there. All of the big television shows are there. So you have the big Game of Thrones panel and whatnot. It's become a really big thing. And it's kind of interesting to see and to think back to that first Comic Con that I went to 24 or 25 years ago, to see that, rather than, most, not even a full exhibition hall, it was like most of, as in slightly more than half of one of the exhibition halls filled with comic book people. And that was it. And to see it now and to see how big it's gotten, it really is amazing to see how it's grown over the past several years. I did notice one thing, though. Speaking of how it's grown, it doesn't appear to have been as big this year as it has been in previous years. When we went down last year, several of the buildings in downtown had been covered with huge banners for various television shows and sci-fi things. And this year there was only one. One of the buildings, the Marriott Hotel, it had one of those big, huge banners on it, and it was the only one that did. It seemed like it wasn't as big outside the convention hall this year as it usually is. There were some exceptions to that. The Tick, which is going to be starting streaming, I guess, in September, they were there with a little pavilion. A couple of other shows were there with some pavilions as well. Blade Runner 2049 had some sort of VR experience outside. So there was some of that stuff, but it just seemed slightly smaller than last year. Last year seemed like they went more all out. I remember last year Assassin's Creed was there. Assassin's Creed had this big obstacle course that they had all these people running, and you would fall off and fall on these big foam things so that nobody got hurt. But I mean, it's a pretty big obstacle course. They had a whole bunch of people running around in the Assassin's Creed robes and hoods. And I would have thought that they would have been there this year, since Assassin's Creed Origins is coming out in just, September? 2 months now. Assassin's Creed Origins will be out, and Assassin's Creed wasn't there. In fact, I saw one little cosplayer who was probably about 10 years old wearing an Assassin's Creed, boots and hood and robe. Other than that, Assassin's Creed wasn't there. I didn't see any of the video game people there this year. Some of the big TV shows were there, like I said, Game of Thrones. The Expanse had a little pavilion that they were doing stuff. The movie The Kingsman had decorated part of the Hard Rock Hotel with the Kingsman men's clothing shop, tailoring shop facade outside. But for the most part, all of the action, I think, was inside the hall. And I didn't even get inside the hall because this Comic-Con has been sold out for so long that there were no tickets available, so it was impossible for me to get in. I live in the city. I should be granted automatic access to these sort of things, but unfortunately, I didn't get it, so everything that I did, I took outside the hall. Anyway, I've got the video of it up. It's on the channel, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. And that's about all that I have for you. That was what Comic-Con was like today. Had a great deal of fun riding the motorcycle down there and taking some videos. I hope you enjoy the video that I took of the Comic-Con stuff while I was down there, and that you'll get a chance to look at that. In any event, that's all I got for you tonight. So have a great weekend, what's left of it. Have a great Sunday. Have a great week upcoming, and I'll be back to talk to you again real soon. Until then, so long.